giant Apache girl, said the lonely rancher. The ranch was quiet except for the soft lowing of the cattle and the occasional clatter of tools from the old barn. The land stretched for miles, dry and dusty, with hardy shrubs and cacti scattered across the red soil. It was a lonely place, a place where silence seemed heavier than the heat of the sun. On the porch of a weathered wooden house, the rancher sat in a creaking chair, his hands resting on the arms, eyes fixed on the horizon. He was a man in his 50s, with skin tanned and rough from years under the relentless sun. His hair, once black, had turned to streaks of gray, and his eyes, sharp and blue, carried a kind of sadness that only came from a lifetime of isolation. He had built the ranch with his own hands after losing his family in a series of tragic accidents years ago. Since then, it had been just him and the land, each day blending into the next. Life on the ranch was hard. Every morning he would feed the cattle, check the fences, and tend to the small patches of crops he managed to grow. The desert was unforgiving, and most days the work left him exhausted, but the routine had become a comfort. It was the only constant in a world that had taken so much from him. He didn't mind the solitude. He had learned to live with it. That morning, however, something was different. A distant figure appeared along the dusty road that led to the ranch. At first it seemed like a mirage, a trick of the heat. But as the figure came closer, the rancher could make out a girl, tall, far taller than anyone he had ever seen, with long dark hair that flowed like a river down her back. Her clothing was simple, worn but neat, and her eyes were sharp and curious, scanning the landscape as if she were measuring it with every step. The rancher frowned. He had never seen anyone come this way before. The nearest town was many miles away, and most travelers avoided the desert unless they had a reason. Something about her presence felt unusual, almost magnetic. She carried herself with a quiet strength, a confidence that seemed at odds with the loneliness that filled the air. By the time she reached the ranch, she was walking with ease, her long strides eating up the distance between them. She stopped at the edge of the fence, looking at him with a calm, steady gaze. "Hello," she said softly, her voice clear and warm. "My name is Aeon. I need a place to stay for a while. Can you help me?" The rancher blinked, unsure of how to respond. He had not expected visitors and certainly not one like her. He studied her carefully. There was something almost otherworldly about her height and presence, yet her eyes told him she was human and she was genuine. Finally, he nodded. "I can give you food and shelter, but you should know life out here isn't easy." Aeon smiled faintly, a small curve of her lips that spoke of quiet determination. "I can handle it," she said simply. "I don't ask for much, only a chance to work." The rancher gestured for her to follow him to the house. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of wood and dust. The furniture was sparse, practical, and well used. He showed her to a small room with a bed and a chest for her belongings. She looked around, taking in the simplicity, but her expression did not falter. "Thank you," she said. "I won't be a burden." "I hope not," the rancher replied. He wasn't sure if he believed her, but there was something in her voice that made him want to trust her. The days that followed were filled with work, the kind that left muscles aching and skin sunburned. Aeon proved herself capable beyond expectation. She could lift heavy sacks of feed, mend fences, and even help with the cattle, her long arms and strong frame making her tasks easier than they would have been for most people. The rancher watched her in silent amazement, feeling a strange mixture of relief and admiration. He had not realized how much he had missed companionship until he saw how smoothly she moved around the ranch, how naturally she became part of the rhythm of life. But it wasn't just her work that intrigued him. It was the way she spoke about the world, the way she noticed details others ignored, the way she commented on the patterns in the clouds, the tracks of animals in the sand, the subtle shifts in the wind. She had a wisdom about her, a sense of understanding that went beyond her years. One evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains and painted the desert in shades of purple and gold, the rancher and Aeon sat on the porch, drinking water from tin cups. The cattle had settled in the pens and the wind whispered through the cacti. "You've been alone here a long time," Aeon said softly, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The rancher nodded. "Too long. I didn't think I needed anyone. The land, it keeps me busy. It keeps me alive. But it's lonely. I'll admit that." Aeon was quiet for a moment, then said something that startled him. "Loneliness is like planting seeds in dry soil. You wait and wait, hoping something will grow, but without care, nothing ever does." He looked at her, surprised by the metaphor. There was a depth in her words that made him pause. "You have a way with words," he said. "I've learned from listening," she replied. "Listening and watching. Life is full of lessons if you know how to see them." From that evening on, a subtle change occurred in the ranch. The silence was no longer heavy. The air seemed lighter with her presence. The rancher found himself talking more, sharing stories of his past, of the accidents that took his family, of the struggles he had faced in keeping the ranch alive. And she listened, always listening, her eyes reflecting understanding rather than judgment. Yet there was still mystery about her. She rarely spoke of her own past, and when she did, it was in fragments, enough to hint at hardship but never enough to tell the full story. The rancher respected that, sensing that trust had to be earned, and that some things were better left in the past until the present was strong enough to handle them. One morning, as they worked side by side repairing a fence that had been damaged by the wind, Aeon paused and looked at him with a serious expression. "I need more than just work here," she said quietly. "I need a place where I can belong, a place where I can grow." The rancher frowned, unsure how to respond. He understood her words in more than one way. She wasn't asking for charity or handouts. She was asking for something deeper: acceptance, a sense of purpose, a home. He realized then that the land was not the only thing that needed care. Hearts did too. "You can stay," he said finally. "You can have that place here, but it's not easy. You'll have to work and you'll have to learn the ways of this land. It's harsh and it can be unforgiving." "I'm ready," she said with quiet confidence. The days turned into weeks, and slowly the ranch began to feel alive in a way it hadn't for years. The cattle were healthier, the crops were growing steadier, and the house felt warmer with her presence. Neighbors began to take notice too. Some were curious, some skeptical, but most were simply surprised that someone like Aeon could live and work in such a place with ease. The rancher, too, was surprised, not by her strength or skill, but by the way she had brought a sense of hope back into his life. He had been prepared to live out his days in solitude, surviving from day to day. But now he found himself imagining a future that was not just about survival, but about living. And in the quiet moments, when the sun dipped low and the desert was bathed in twilight, he realized something remarkable. The ranch was no longer just his refuge from the world. It had become a place of connection, of growth, of possibility. And it had happened because of her, the girl who had appeared one morning, tall and mysterious, and asked only for a chance. For the first time in years, the rancher felt a sense of peace. He didn't know what the future would hold, but he knew one thing: he was no longer alone. And sometimes, that was enough to make even the harshest desert feel like home. Life on the ranch began to change in ways the rancher had never expected. Aeon had settled into her routine, waking before dawn to help feed the cattle, checking the fences, and tending to the small vegetable patch that had stubbornly refused to grow in the harsh desert soil. She moved with a quiet strength that amazed the rancher every day, lifting heavy sacks and handling the horses with confidence. He had seen many young people work, but none with her combination of determination, patience, and care. One morning, the rancher watched her as she carefully watered the little vegetable patch. The sun was still low, casting long shadows across the red earth. She bent over the soil, her long hair falling over her shoulders, and spoke softly to the plants. It was not a language of words, but a gentle rhythm of care and attention. He frowned slightly, feeling a strange warmth in his chest. He had never thought he would find watching someone work so calming, so comforting. "You talk to the plants," he said finally, breaking the silence. Aeon looked up and smiled faintly. "Not with words, I talk with care. The world listens if you know how to pay attention." The rancher shook his head, amused but also intrigued. "I've never heard anyone say that before." "Most people don't notice," she replied. "They're too busy rushing through life. But the land, the animals, they notice everything. You just have to slow down and see." Her words stayed with him throughout the day. He found himself walking through the fields more slowly, noticing the tracks of small animals in the dust, the way the wind whispered through the grass, the subtle differences in color in the soil. It was as if she had opened his eyes to a world he had lived in but never truly seen. As the weeks passed, their bond grew stronger. They worked side by side, sharing the chores, talking about the world, and laughing at small moments of frustration. When the cattle wandered off or the fences broke, they would chase after the animals together, their movements synchronized in a way that only comes from hours of shared effort. The rancher found himself speaking more openly about his past, about the accidents that had taken his family, about the loneliness that had filled his life for so many years. And Aeon listened, always listening, never judging, her eyes reflecting understanding and quiet empathy. One afternoon, as the sun blazed high in the sky, Aeon suggested they take a break near the small stream that ran at the edge of the ranch. The water was clear and cold, a rare treasure in the desert. They sat on the smooth rocks, letting the water slip through their fingers and listening to its soft, constant flow. "You've carried a heavy burden," Aeon said softly. "The land is not the only thing that needs tending. People need care too, especially those who have lost much." The rancher nodded, his gaze fixed on the stream. "I thought I could handle it alone. I thought I didn't need anyone, but it turns out I was wrong." She smiled, a small, knowing smile. "It takes courage to admit that, and it takes even more courage to let someone in." He looked at her, seeing not just the strength and height that had first struck him, but a deep, quiet wisdom that made him feel both humbled and inspired. "And what about you?" he asked. "You've been through a lot too, haven't you?" Aeon's expression darkened slightly, though not with anger or sadness, but with memory. "I have," she said quietly, "but some things are better left in the past until the present is strong enough to hold them." He understood immediately. She trusted him enough to share a little but not everything, and he respected that. Trust, he realized, could not be rushed. It had to grow, like the crops in the soil, nurtured by patience and care. The days continued in this rhythm, and slowly the ranch began to feel alive again. The small vegetable patch flourished under Aeon's care, green shoots rising from the once barren soil. The cattle were healthier, their coats shinier, and the fences, once weak and worn, were sturdy and secure. Even the house seemed to hum with a new energy, as if her presence had brought warmth and light into every corner. Neighbors began to notice the changes too. Some came by to ask for advice or to trade supplies, curious about the girl who had appeared out of nowhere and seemed to transform the ranch with her work and care. The rancher found himself answering questions he would have ignored in the past, proud of what they had accomplished together. And Aeon, quiet and unassuming, would smile politely, never seeking praise, yet earning it all the same. One evening, after a long day of work, the rancher found himself standing at the edge of the field, watching the sunset. Aeon approached quietly, carrying 2 cups of water. She handed one to him without a word, and they stood together, the silence between them comfortable and easy. "Do you ever think about leaving?" the rancher asked suddenly, not looking at her. "Some people like to wander to find new places. I've always wondered if I might have done the same if life had been different." Aeon shook her head gently. Not anymore. This place, it feels like where I belong, and I think you feel the same even if you don't say it out loud." He looked at her then, really looked, and realized she was right. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of home, not just in the land or the house, but in the companionship they had built together. It was strange, and yet it felt natural, like something he had been waiting for without knowing it. The next morning brought a new challenge. A sudden storm rolled in from the mountains, dark clouds blotting out the sun and whipping the desert with strong winds. Rain fell in heavy sheets, and the cattle panicked in their pens. The rancher and Aeon worked tirelessly to secure the animals, fix the damaged fences, and protect the crops. They moved with urgency, shouting instructions over the roar of the storm, their hands working together seamlessly despite the chaos. By the time the storm passed, both were soaked to the bone and exhausted, but the ranch had survived. They stood in the mud, catching their breath, and looked at each other with tired smiles. "You did well," the rancher said, clapping her on the shoulder. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Aeon laughed softly, shaking the water from her hair. "We did it together. That's how things survive." As the days grew longer and the rains became less frequent, the rancher noticed a new quality in their partnership. Aeon's presence had brought not only strength and skill, but also hope and renewal. He began to imagine a future where the ranch was not just a place of survival, but a place of growth, growth in the land, in the cattle, and in themselves. One afternoon, as they worked side by side in the fields, Aeon paused and looked at him seriously. "I want to do more than just work here," she said. Her voice was calm but firm. "I want to learn, to understand, to be part of something that matters. I want to grow, not just for myself, but for the place and the life we're building." The rancher stopped and considered her words. They were not a complaint or a demand, but a plea for trust and guidance. He realized then that life had given him a gift, not just in her work, but in her willingness to invest herself in the ranch and in him. It was like planting a seed in dry soil, hoping it would take root and flourish. And for the first time, he understood what it truly meant to nurture something beyond himself. "You can grow here," he said finally, his voice quiet but certain. "And I'll help you. But you have to promise to keep learning, to keep caring. The land doesn't forgive laziness or neglect." "I promise," she said, her eyes shining with determination. "I'll give it everything I have." From that day forward, their partnership deepened even further. They shared not only the work but also the dreams, the quiet hopes of a better life, and the small joys of daily victories. They celebrated the first sprouts of crops, the birth of new calves, and the repair of a fence that had stood weak for years. Each small success strengthened their bond, teaching them that life could flourish even in the harshest conditions if tended with care, patience, and respect. At night, when the ranch was quiet and the stars shone bright above the desert, the rancher would sometimes find himself reflecting on the changes in his life. He had expected solitude and hardship, but instead, he had found companionship, trust, and a sense of purpose that he had thought was lost forever. And Aeon, tall and strong, had shown him that even the most barren land could bloom if someone cared enough to nurture it. In the weeks and months that followed, the ranch became a place of life and energy, a place where growth was possible in every corner, not just in the fields but in their hearts as well. And the rancher understood something profound. Life was not just about surviving the days, it was about planting seeds, nurturing them, and watching them grow, sometimes in ways that surprise you, sometimes in ways that change everything. For the first time in a long time, he felt hope. And with hope, he realized, came the courage to truly live. The ranch had grown stronger, healthier, and more alive over the past months. But life in the desert never remained peaceful for long. One morning, the rancher noticed something unusual while walking along the edge of the property. A few of the cattle were missing, their tracks leading toward a narrow canyon that cut into the mountains. His stomach tightened. Predators were rare but possible, and human interference such as rustlers could never be ruled out. He immediately thought of Aeon, who had been tending the vegetable patch near the stream. "Aeon," he called, his voice carrying across the fields. She looked up, her dark hair falling across her face as she wiped her hands on her apron. "What is it?" she asked, concern flashing in her eyes. "Some of the cattle are missing. I need you to come with me," he said. They mounted the horses and rode toward the canyon, their movements urgent but controlled. The desert seemed unusually still, as if holding its breath. The tracks were clear, showing signs that the cattle had been herded deliberately, not lost on their own. The rancher felt a sinking feeling in his chest. Someone had taken them. "They're rustlers," he muttered under his breath. "Someone trying to steal what we've built." Aeon's eyes narrowed. "We can't let them get away. We have to act carefully." The rancher nodded. He trusted her instincts. Over the past months, she had proven herself capable, intelligent, and brave. Together, they could face any challenge. The canyon was narrow, with steep cliffs on either side. Dust swirled around their horses' hooves as they followed the trail. Soon they spotted movement ahead, figures moving quickly, driving the stolen cattle deeper into the canyon. The rancher's heart pounded. This was no longer a test of skill. It was a test of courage, trust, and strategy. Aeon leaned close to him. "We need to split them up. If we can separate the cattle, we can confuse the rustlers and guide the animals back home." He hesitated. The plan was risky and the canyon's cliffs offered little room for error, but he trusted her judgment. "Okay, let's do it," he said. They rode forward, careful to remain hidden behind large boulders and the canyon walls. Aeon led, her movements precise, her eyes scanning every detail. She pointed to a narrow path where the cattle could be gently guided away. The rancher followed, working with her silently, their horses moving as if they understood the urgency. The rustlers noticed them eventually, shouting and waving their arms. But by then, Aeon and the rancher had already begun separating the cattle, leading some back toward the open fields where the rest of the ranch awaited. It was exhausting work, requiring quick thinking, bravery, and unspoken coordination. They worked without pause until finally, the rustlers, frustrated and unable to control all the cattle, abandoned their attempt and fled. By the time the last cow had returned safely to the pens, both the rancher and Aeon were covered in dust and sweat, their bodies aching from the effort. But a sense of triumph filled the air. They had protected their home, their livelihood, and their partnership. "You did well," the rancher said, his voice steady but filled with admiration. "I couldn't have done this without you." Aeon smiled, tired but satisfied. "We did it together. That's the only way." The days after the incident were tense but hopeful. They repaired the damage to the fences, tended to the frightened cattle, and reinforced their defenses. The rancher found himself reflecting on how quickly life could change, how fragile it was, and how necessary trust, courage, and teamwork were to survival. Aeon had taught him that strength came not only from physical ability, but also from wisdom, patience, and the willingness to act decisively when it mattered most. One evening, after the work was done, they sat on the porch, drinking water and watching the sun set behind the mountains. The sky was painted with soft shades of pink and gold, the air calm and still after the storm of recent events. "You've changed this place," the rancher said quietly. "Not just the land or the ranch, but me. I didn't realize how much I needed someone like you until you arrived." Aeon's gaze softened. "I've changed too," she said. "I've learned that strength isn't just about surviving alone. It's about trusting others, working together, and caring enough to protect what matters." The rancher nodded. Her words reminded him of the desert itself, harsh, unyielding, but full of life and opportunity when tended with care. "I was afraid of losing people," he admitted. "I thought letting someone in meant risking more pain, but you've shown me that it's worth it." Aeon reached out, placing her hand lightly on his arm. Life is always worth it if you choose to nurture it, even when it's difficult. That's how things grow. The next few weeks brought new challenges, but also new joys. The crops thrived under their careful attention, and the cattle were healthy and strong. The rancher found himself teaching Aeon skills he had learned over a lifetime: how to repair fences more efficiently, how to track the patterns of the weather, how to read the signs of the land. She absorbed every lesson with determination, often improving upon his methods with her own clever ideas. One afternoon, they discovered a patch of land that had long been neglected. The soil was dry and cracked, the weeds overgrown, and the rocks scattered. The rancher frowned, unsure if it was even worth the effort to try to restore it. Aeon knelt and ran her fingers through the soil. "This can grow," she said confidently. "It just needs care, patience, and the right attention. Let me show you." He watched as she cleared the weeds, loosened the soil, and carefully planted seeds, explaining each step as she worked. He was amazed at her knowledge and precision, and even more amazed at how she treated the land as if it were alive, deserving of care and respect. For hours they worked side by side, their movements synchronized, their conversation easy and light despite the hard labor. By evening, the first seeds were planted, and the barren patch of land had begun the slow transformation toward life. The rancher felt a sense of pride and hope that he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't just about the crops, it was about what they symbolized: the potential for growth, the results of care and attention, and the possibility of a future built together. But not all moments were peaceful. One afternoon, while checking the fences near the edge of the property, they spotted a group of travelers on horseback approaching from a distance. The travelers were strangers, their intentions unclear. The rancher's heart tightened. He had learned over the years that appearances could be deceptive, and that the desert held both kindness and danger in equal measure. Aeon noticed his tension and placed a hand on his shoulder. "We will face this together," she said softly. "Trust me." They waited, observing the travelers as they drew closer. The strangers dismounted and approached cautiously, explaining that their wagon had broken down and that they needed water and food for their horses. The rancher studied them carefully, noting nothing suspicious in their behavior. He nodded, and together they guided the travelers to the stream and offered them what they could. As the travelers rested, the rancher realized how much he had changed. In the past, he would have been suspicious of strangers, keeping them at a distance. But now, with Aeon by his side, he saw the value in helping others, in offering kindness without immediately expecting reward or suspicion. It was a lesson in trust and generosity, and one that reminded him how much he had grown alongside her. The days turned into weeks, and the ranch continued to thrive. But the true test of their partnership came one afternoon when a sudden heat wave struck the desert. Temperatures soared, the sun beating down relentlessly, and the water in the stream began to shrink. The cattle grew restless and thirsty, and the crops started to wilt under the unrelenting heat. The rancher and Aeon worked tirelessly, carrying water to the fields, setting up shade for the animals, and rationing supplies to ensure survival. They took shifts, resting only when necessary, their bodies exhausted, their faces red from the sun. Yet neither complained. They were determined to protect what they had built together, to ensure that the ranch and each other survived the challenge. By the time the sun finally set, casting long shadows over the desert, they collapsed onto the porch, dripping with sweat and dust. They looked at each other, sharing a silent understanding that they had faced one of the harshest tests yet, and they had endured it together. "You're stronger than I ever imagined," the rancher said finally, his voice tired but full of admiration. "And you are wiser than I thought," Aeon replied, a small smile on her face. "We make a good team." That night, as they sat under the stars, the rancher realized something he had not expected to feel again: a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the ranch or its success, but for Aeon. She had entered his life like a force of nature, bringing strength, wisdom, and care, and in doing so she had shown him what it truly meant to nurture, protect, and grow something beyond oneself. He thought of the seeds they had planted, both in the soil and in their lives. Each challenge, each hardship had taught them patience, resilience, and the value of trust. And for the first time in many years, he felt that the future held not fear or loneliness, but hope, promise, and the possibility of new beginnings. The desert had changed with the seasons, just as the rancher and Aeon had changed alongside it. The once barren fields were now green with thriving crops, the cattle strong and healthy, and the house filled with a warmth that had been missing for so many years. Life was not easy, and it never would be in the harsh Arizona desert, but the ranch had become a place of hope, resilience, and growth. One morning, the rancher woke before dawn, as he usually did, and stepped onto the porch. The sky was painted with soft shades of pink and purple, and a cool breeze swept across the land. He could hear the gentle lowing of the cattle and the distant rustle of leaves in the small grove of trees near the stream. For the first time in years, he felt at peace, a quiet sense of satisfaction settling over him. Aeon was already up, tending to the vegetable patch. Her long hair caught the early light, and her movements were precise and careful, as if she were performing a ritual she had practiced for years. The rancher watched her for a moment, feeling a sense of pride and admiration. She had come into his life like a storm, changing everything, and yet bringing a calm that he had never known he needed. "Good morning," he called softly, his voice carrying over the fields. Aeon looked up and smiled, wiping her hands on her apron. "Good morning," she replied. "The crops need water before the sun gets too strong." Together, they worked through the morning, tending to the land, checking the fences, and ensuring the cattle had plenty of water and shade. It was hard, steady work, but it was also rewarding. The rancher felt a sense of fulfillment he had never known before. He was no longer just surviving. He was creating, nurturing, and protecting something that mattered deeply. After the chores were done, they sat on the porch, drinking cool water and watching the desert stretch endlessly before them. The silence between them was comfortable, a shared understanding that words were not always necessary. But Aeon broke it gently. "You've come a long way," she said softly, "not just with the ranch but with yourself. You've learned to trust, to care, and to open your heart again." The rancher nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "And you've helped me see that life isn't just about surviving. It's about growing, about nurturing, about building something that lasts." They talked quietly about the past, the hardships they had faced, and the lessons they had learned. The rancher shared memories of his family, of the loneliness that had followed their loss, and the fear that he would never find a connection as strong as the one he had lost. Aeon listened, her eyes full of understanding, never interrupting, never judging. "I was afraid," he admitted finally. "Afraid to let anyone in, afraid to risk being hurt again. But you've shown me that life is richer when you take those risks, when you open yourself to trust and care." Aeon reached out and placed her hand lightly on his arm. "And you've shown me that even in a harsh, unforgiving place, growth is possible. We've both planted seeds and we've nurtured them together. Look at what we've built." The rancher looked around, taking in the fields, the cattle, the repaired fences, and the small vegetable patch. Everything was alive, thriving, and full of promise. But more than that, he saw the bond they had formed, the partnership, the trust, and the deep care that had grown between them over months of shared effort. Their sense of accomplishment was interrupted one afternoon by a visitor from the nearby town. The man was older, weathered by the sun, and carried a message from the county. A small parcel of land had been offered for sale nearby, and the county suggested the rancher and Aeon might consider expanding their property. The rancher and Aeon looked at each other thoughtfully. Expansion meant more work, more responsibility, and new challenges, but it also meant the opportunity to grow, to create something lasting for the future. They discussed it carefully, weighing the risks and benefits, and finally agreed that it was a chance they could not pass up. Over the following weeks, they worked tirelessly to purchase and integrate the new land into the ranch. They cleared debris, repaired old fences, and planted new crops, expanding their territory and their opportunities. The process was exhausting, but it brought them closer, teaching them patience, teamwork, and the satisfaction of shared effort. One evening, after a long day of work, they sat together on a hill overlooking the ranch. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the land, and the air was filled with the scent of dry earth and growing crops. The rancher turned to Aeon, his eyes reflecting the golden light. "I never imagined life could be like this," he said quietly. "I thought the desert was all I would ever know, hardship, loneliness, and silence. But you've shown me something different. You've shown me life can bloom even here." Aeon smiled, her eyes shining with quiet happiness. "And you've shown me that care and determination can turn even the harshest places into something beautiful. We've grown together, and now the ranch is growing too." The following months brought new joys and small celebrations. They welcomed the birth of new calves, the first harvest of their expanded crops, and the successful repair of the oldest barn on the property. Each success was a reminder that life was not just about survival. It was about growth, effort, and the care invested in the things and people that mattered most. Through it all, their partnership deepened. They shared meals, stories, and laughter, discovering a rhythm to life that was both comforting and inspiring. The rancher found himself opening up in ways he had never expected, sharing dreams for the future, hopes for continued growth, and even fears that had lingered in his heart for years. Aeon, in turn, shared pieces of her own past, stories of her childhood, and the experiences that had shaped her, building a trust that was steady, strong, and enduring. One particularly hot afternoon, as they rested beneath the shade of a large mesquite tree, Aeon spoke softly. "We've done so much," she said, "but there's still more to build, more to learn, and more to grow. Life will always challenge us, but together I think we can face anything." The rancher nodded, feeling a deep sense of certainty. "Together," he agreed. "I've learned that life is about planting seeds, not just in the soil but in the hearts of the people we care about. And with care, patience, and effort, those seeds will grow." Winter arrived with its own set of challenges. Cold nights and occasional frost threatened the crops and the cattle, but the rancher and Aeon were prepared. They reinforced barns, ensured water supplies were secure, and tended to the animals with the same care and dedication they had shown throughout the year. The hardships brought them closer, reinforcing the lessons they had learned: resilience, patience, trust, and the power of shared effort. One snowy evening, after the chores were done and the cattle were safely settled, they sat by the fireplace in the old ranch house. The wind howled outside, and the desert was silent and white under a thin layer of snow. The rancher reflected on the journey they had taken together, from the first day Aeon appeared, to the trials of rustlers, storms, heat waves, and expansion. Each challenge had been a lesson, each hardship a test of their strength and partnership. "I never thought I could feel this way again," he admitted quietly. "I thought loneliness was permanent, that the desert would always be my only companion. But you've changed that. You've brought life, hope, and purpose back into my world." Aeon smiled, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "And you've shown me that even in the hardest places, growth is possible. We've built something together, something that will last, something worth nurturing." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the wind outside and the crackle of the fire, feeling the deep satisfaction of accomplishment, trust, and companionship. The ranch was thriving, their partnership was strong, and their hearts were full. As spring returned, the ranch was a place of vibrant life. The fields were green, the cattle were strong, and the trees bore fruit once more. Birds returned to the property, singing in the morning sun, and the air was filled with the scent of growth and renewal. The rancher and Aeon walked through the fields together, their hands brushing occasionally, sharing smiles and laughter, and speaking quietly about the plans for the future. "I think the ranch has become more than a home," the rancher said. "It's a place of life, growth, and possibility, and it's because of you, because of us." Aeon looked at him, her eyes warm and full of trust. "And it's because of you too. We've both nurtured it, cared for it, and helped it grow. Together, we've turned the desert into something alive." The months passed, and the ranch continued to flourish. They faced challenges, as life always did, but each one was met with courage, care, and the lessons they had learned together. The land was alive, the animals were healthy, and the house was filled with warmth and laughter. The seeds they had planted, both in the soil and in each other's lives, had grown strong and resilient. One evening, as the sun set in a brilliant display of gold and red, the rancher and Aeon stood at the edge of the fields, looking out over the land they had nurtured together. The desert stretched endlessly, but it was no longer barren. It was full of life, hope, and possibility. "We've done well," the rancher said quietly. "Not just with the ranch, but with each other. We've built something that will last." Aeon smiled, her hand brushing against his. "Yes, and we will continue to grow together." As the stars appeared one by one in the clear desert sky, they knew that life would continue to bring challenges, joys, and lessons. But they also knew that together, they could face anything, nurture anything, and grow anything they chose. The ranch was no longer just land. It was a testament to patience, care, trust, and the power of partnership. And in that quiet moment, with the desert stretching endlessly before them and the stars shining bright above, they felt a deep sense of peace, fulfillment, and hope for all the days yet to come.